Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to MLA's Sheep Productivity and Profitability webinar series. Tonight's webinar is titled Using Teasers to Improve Prime Lamb Reproduction Rates, and it's going to be presented by Ashley Herbert of Agrarian Management based in Western Australia. Next week we've got another webinar, and it's going to be a joint presentation between myself, David Brown of Home Sacket, and Director of Independent Commodity Services, Andrew Woods. That webinar is going to be focused specifically on whether we actually have any cost-effective management options to increase the wool income from prime lamb flocks. So Andrew Woods is going to be looking at what potential there is to increase prime lamb wool income through reduction in micron or increase in fleece weight. And I'm going to be looking at some of the management strategies we have with our prime lamb flocks to achieve that additional income. You should be able to see this control panel on the right hand side of your screen. The red button will collapse or reinstate that control panel as you need to. We can't hear you, but you should be able to hear us. And that questions box at the bottom of the control panel is very important to tonight's webinar. That's where you can let me know if you can't hear me or something's going wrong. And also that's where you log your questions for Ashley Herbert to address at the end of the webinar. Tonight's presenter, Ashley Herbert, is a consultant and principal of Agrarian Management, a farm business management consultancy based in Western Australia. Ashley started his career at Katanning with the Western Australian Department of Agriculture, but over the last 23 odd years he has been involved with agrarian management in the space of farm management, and with particular focus on sheep production systems. And Ashley has a strong knowledge of the drivers of farm business profitability and the technical wherewithal required to generate those high levels of farm management, farm profitability. Ashley is has been working on this topic about teasers in preparation for tonight's webinar, and I'm very certain that he's the right man to be presenting on this topic. And I look forward to hearing about everything we need to know about the use of teasers in prime lamb flocks. With that, I'd like to introduce Ashley to the webinar. I'll just give you 1 second. Good evening, Ashley. Can you hear us there?
Evening, David. Yes, I can. Loud and clear.
Perfect. I'll let you start your slideshow and take it from here.
Thank you, David, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. This is my first webinar, so I'm very pleased to be presenting. So thank you for joining me. Now, look, as David said, I'm based here in Western Australia. I've been consulting in the Great Southern, the medium to high rainfall area for near on 20 odd years, 23, 24 years, and predominantly dealing with mixed farms and sheep. The sheep production system has been, I guess, the mainstay of my client's business, and I guess through that work I've done a lot of benchmarking and measured performance between farms, and that's just given me a wealth of, I guess, knowledge and understanding as to how really people go about making money from sheep, certainly in our environment. And I guess that's sort of my background. Mixed farming in our part of the world works very well, and sheep, particularly merino sheep, are a strong part of that. And having said that, though, on average, roughly a third of our merino ewes are joined to a terminal sire. Now that varies a lot. Some people join all their merino ewes to a terminal sire, and some people don't join any. But generally, half the people would have a proportion of ewes joined to a terminal sire. I don't see a lot of first cross ewes or composite types. They're relatively minor in the sheep landscape in Western Australia, but they're certainly there, and there are reasonable numbers of them. Okay, now look, my topic today is just talking about teasers. Now what I'll do is just really talk about, when we say teasers and using teasers, I'll talk about what it actually is we're talking about, and then I'll go through the mechanics of how it works, what's driving it, and that will hopefully help explain who might use it and where it would be useful, and ultimately what it's useful for. And then I'll finish with just the mechanics of what you physically do to actually use to get teasers into the use, and just the I suppose the mechanics of how it's done. So I thought I'd just like just to really start, I'd just like to look at, when we say using teasers, what are we actually talking about? Let's make your screen. There we go. Okay, so what is it? Well, basically, look, it's just a tactic that we use to stimulate the breeding cycle of ewes, and if the end result is it ultimately synchronizes ovulation of ewes within a flock, which has the ultimate result of concentrating the lamb drop over a shorter period. Now, it's really only effective for ewes that are what we call out of season. So these are ewes that are not in their normal sort of cycling period. And it's really, where is it useful? Well, it's useful when there's value in having lambs dropped over a shorter time frame.
Ashley,
typically in Western Australia.
Could I just jump in there, Ashley? Could you blow your screen up, please, to full size?
Oh, sorry, it's not working. Apologies for that.
No worries, thank you.
Gotcha. Apologies, everybody. So it's using teasers is really useful when there's value to management in having a lambing period that's shorter, so our lambs are concentrated in a shorter period. Now, what using teasers is not about is generally doesn't demonstrably or reliably increase the number of lambs born. Okay, now there's a few accounts of that it does actually increase the number of twins conceived slightly, which probably would lead in some cases to a small number of lambs, increase in number of lambs born. But generally, if there's any lamb production increase from using teasers, it's usually driven by the improvement in weaner management or just basic management by having a more concise drop of lambs. It's not about the teasing itself, I suppose. So if you're thinking of using teasing to produce more lambs per se, then there's probably other things you need to look at to get a better reward for your effort. So clearly, using teasers is in no way a substitute for the standard drivers of reproduction, being condition score, body weight, or nutrition of the ewe. And also, it doesn't have any effect for in-season breeding. So when we're joining ewes in their natural breeding season, using teasers isn't really going to help that at all. Now, the second part of that third point is that it's not really effective for breeds that are strongly seasonal, and I'll go into that in a moment. So I thought I'd just spend a bit of time now explaining what we mean by in-season, out-of-season breeding, just to clarify that, because that's really the backbone of using teasers. Now, what we have here is a graph that it just measures ewe sort of breeding behaviour through the course of a year, and you can see there's what we've got. The black line is the proportion of ewes in a flock that are ovulating at any given time. And you can see there's a very distinct wave pattern. And what's that reflecting is ewes through from, say, July to sort of mid to late January are effectively out of season. So reproductively, they're becoming less and less active naturally. Now, this is what happens typically to merinos, particularly in the absence of rams. Okay, so when they're not exposed to rams, they will cycle through breeding seasons in this sort of pattern. Now, when we say in season, that's the period when the ewes are naturally cycling. So they're ovulating, they're displaying mating behaviour, they're making it quite clear to the rams that they're ready to mate. Another word for that is estrus. Estrus is showing estrus behaviour. It's about mating behaviour. They're ovulating. Anestrus is when effectively they're not ovulating and they're not showing any mating behaviour. It's probably worth making the point that when the ewes are sort of cycling or on heat, they actually can go out and seek the rams. So they'll actually try and find a ram and present themselves to the ram as much as the ram comes to find them. So when they're in season, they make it quite clear to the ram that they're ready to join. Now the graph on the right here is just an example of what we call these strongly seasonal breeds, and typically Border Leicesters are a real classic for that. They're strongly seasonal, which means during the out of season period, very few ewes are cycling naturally, and they have a very strong effect in season. Now these breeds here typically don't respond well to using teasers. They've just got such a strong seasonal pattern to their breeding cycle. It's difficult to manipulate that sort of conventionally. And the main response to the breeding cycle is in day length. So when we're going through the sort of January, February, March, April period, the days are getting shorter, and that's what drives the reproduction system to come on. Now, typically through the peak of the breeding season, which is sort of February, March, April, there's also an increase in the ovulation rate, and that's this line here. It's just illustrating the proportion of ewes that will naturally be ovulating multiples. So you can see sheep of all breeds are quite cyclical. Merinos are what you might call moderately cyclical. Breeds like Border Leicesters are strongly seasonal, I beg your pardon. So Merinos are moderately seasonal. Now, when we're looking at teasing relies on harnessing what we call the ram effect, and that's effectively what that's effectively the effect on the ewe the ram has when he comes in contact with her. So it's principally aimed at this period here when the ewes are naturally not cycling, and it's about when they come into contact with rams, they start cycling. I thought we might spend a little bit of time just explaining how the ram effect works. Now, typically what happens when we have a ram come in contact with some ewes. Now, it's important to remember at this point that these are ewes that have not been in any contact whatsoever with any rams at all. So they're totally, I guess the word is naive to rams. So from the moment they come in contact with rams, the rams are releasing pheromones all the time. Now the ewes effectively get a sniff of this, and that triggers a response to their reproduction system, and it kicks into gear very quickly. So within 2 or 3 days of being in contact or near the rams, they have this first ovulation. Now, most of the ewes will go through this first ovulation very quickly. The significance of this ovulation is it's a silent ovulation or a silent heat, which means the ewes don't display any outward signs of being in season. So they don't have any mating behaviour. The rams are totally unaware of it, and probably the ewes are too. They just don't know what's happening. So that happens automatically. That's 2 to 3 days after the rams come in contact with the ewes. Now, 6 to 8 days after that, approximately half the ewes will have another silent ovulation. The other half won't. So you have this second ovulation, which is silent, which means the ewes haven't changed their behaviour. They're not exhibiting any mating behaviour. The rams are totally unaware of it. Now, the next activity is 17 days after this first ovulation. We have our first real of ovulation, which means the ewes are exhibiting mating behaviour. They'll make it quite clear to the rams they're ready to join, and this is sort of in that 18 to 20 day period from when the rams come in. So this is when the first real opportunity is for the ewes to be joined and conceived. And the second opportunity is sort of around 23 to 25 days from when the rams come in. These ewes here that had the second silent ovulation, they then have their first real ovulation and display mating behaviour. So what you can see from here, from when the rams come in, it's taken nearly 25 days, so just over 3 weeks, for pretty much all the ewes in the flock to have an opportunity for one conception. And of course, if they don't conceive on those particular cycles, it'll be another 17 days before they're able to have another chance at conceiving. So this is, if you look at this is why from a sort of December joining, we typically need to join for at least 6 weeks. And I guess in my experience, most people join for 7 or 8, because there's 2 weeks at the start where there's really no chance of any conception. And then we've got 2 cycles to try and pick up all the ewes in that period. So that takes us to 6 to 7 weeks to make sure ewes have had ample opportunity to conceive. Now, what does that look like when we look at a flock of ewes? So here we have the number of ewes that are pregnant, the proportion of ewes in a flock of ewes that are pregnant from when the rams go in. So I've got joining days from joining along the bottom, and we've got proportion of ewes on the vertical. Now this is a typical flock of merino ewes joined in December. So what I think what's important to notice is that for the first 2 weeks or so, there's really not much happening from a pregnancy point of view. It's not until we get past that 2-week period that we start to see a significant increase in the number of ewes that are joined. Now, for the first 3 weeks, typically less than 40% of ewes are pregnant. And after 5 weeks, just over 80% of ewes are pregnant. Now, the other important feature of this graph is that after 7 weeks, there's very few extra lambs. I guess this sort of illustrates why we talk about constraining December joining to 7 weeks, because going to 8 weeks, adding another week to the lambing window, but only picking up a very, very small number of lambs. Now, if we compare this, to a February joining, because the ewes are naturally at a high rate of cycling, from day 1 of when the rams go in, there's a very, very rapid increase in the number of ewes that are pregnant. And if you remember, with December joining, after 3 weeks, less than 40% of ewes are joined, have conceived. With, say, February joining, when the ewes are in their natural breeding season, we've got over 80% of ewes pregnant within 3 weeks. And after 5 weeks, there's very few extra lambs sort of conceived after a 5-week period. And that sort of illustrates why with, say, December joining, we advocate sort of 7 weeks of joining, and with February joining, we advocate 5 weeks. And you can see then there's quite distinct differences in the ages of the weaners at weaning. There's at least 7 or 8 weeks age difference with the December joining. There's only 5-week joining. There's only 5 weeks of age difference between the youngest and the oldest with a February joining. So the aim of using teasers is to effectively shortcut this 2-week lag at the start of lambing and put our rams in here. So we're going to use teasers to really get our ewes ready, so they're ready to go as soon as the rams go in. Now, typically with teasers, what we do is we put the teasers in 2 weeks before we want to put the rams in. So we're just replicating that 2-week period where not much lambing generally happens. And this is from the Lifetime Ewe Management Project. Typically, some teasers have gone in here. 2 weeks later, the rams go in, and we see a very rapid increase in the reproductive rate of the flock from pretty much from day one. So after 3 weeks, we've got around 80% of our ewes pregnant, and then after 5 weeks, there's very little increase in the number of lambs that are possible, which is mimicking very much the February joining. And that's essentially what we're trying to do. So we're trying to get the bulk of our lambs in a very short window. Okay, so just to give some flavour of, in a practical sense, what does that look like? This is the results from some work the Department of Agriculture did in the 1980s, and it's looking at teasers, teased ewes versus unteased ewes, and the number of lambs born in the first 3 weeks. So you can see there's clear differences in every week of joining in terms of how many lambs were conceived and ultimately born. And within 3 weeks, there's 35% more lambs conceived and born in the first 3 weeks. Now these are for merinos, and I was saying they're moderately seasonal, so there's always going to be a reasonable proportion of those ewes cycling in that out of season period. But that's still a significant number, and from a weaner management, a lamb management point of view, I think that makes quite a significant difference. Okay, now the point here is, what do we use as teasers? Well, essentially, there's two types. There's vasectomized rams, which are effectively sterilized rams. The key point here is that if you're using vasectomized rams, it's important to be able to differentiate them from your working rams, because ultimately, as you can probably appreciate, if you're joining sterile rams accidentally with your ewes, it's not going to give you a very commercial result. So it's important. It's been mentioned that people might use a different breed, so it's quite obvious which ones are vasectomized, which ones are working rams. And the other point to remember is that it's a surgical procedure, so obviously a vet needs to be involved to get that job done. Now, it's relatively inexpensive, and you only have to do it once to a particular ram, and that ram is good for 4 or 5 years. So it's relatively cheap, and the rams generally last for a long time. But probably the more common approach, certainly in my experience in Western Australia, is wethers are treated with testosterone. And ideally, you want to use sort of mature age wethers, but these days there's not that many mature age wethers around. So younger wethers do work. It's just ideally, if you have the choice, you go for the older wether. Now, we use testosterone, and you can only get that from a vet. There's certain conditions that the vets are able to sell testosterone products to producers. Now, importantly to remember, it is an off-label practice, and you do need to talk to your vet about what's the appropriate withholding period. This is the advice I've been given from Durox, who sell one of the testosterone products. It's not a label. The activity of preparing wethers for teasers isn't on the label, and they're suggesting, in terms of understanding withholding, you should have that discussion with your vet. Okay, now this is the most common approach. It's relatively simple. We basically are injecting subcutaneously 5 mils of testosterone in our teasers, and then 7 days later, we're joining our teasers with our ewes. Now, I think in a lot of the literature, they sort of suggest joining rates of 0.5 to 1% is what you need to do. But in the literature and talking to various people who do this routinely, the rate ranges from 0.5% to 5%. There's a number of people that maintain that the more teasers you use, the more successful it tends to be. And then 2 weeks later, you can leave the wethers in, you join your working rams with the ewes at a minimum of 1.5%. Now, the significance of that is you just remember that you've got you've effectively prepared the ewe flock to have the bulk of its ovulation happening in the first 3 weeks. Okay, so you need to make sure you've got plenty of rams to get around to all the ewes in good time, to not waste that opportunity. I'll just make the point that it's important to make sure that the rams go in 2 weeks after the teasers have gone in. If you leave them in too much longer, what happens is the ewes have only got, when they're out of season, the ewes have only got 2 or 3 cycles in them before they start to shut down again. So if they're out of season and the teasers are in for 3 weeks, you run the risk of the ewes who don't conceive early in the joining not having sufficient time to have not having sufficient cycles to be joined. So it's important that the teasers are only in there for 2 weeks and the rams come in at that point. Now with vasectomized rams, it's relatively simple. They go in at day 0, and then 2 weeks in, you take them out and you join the working rams in. Now it's important to take the vasectomized rams out because they will compete with working rams. Wethers aren't a problem because generally working rams are significantly bigger than wethers, and they will outcompete them for ewes. But if you've got vasectomized rams, they really need to come out. And then 5 weeks later, we take the working rams out. Now, I've been asked to comment on using teasers with ewe lambs, and it is really difficult to find any useful data of teasers and joining ewe lambs. The discussions I've had and a bit of information I've been able to find is that there's every reason to expect that the ram effect will work with ewe lambs. But look, live weight and age still remain the big drivers of successful joining of ewe lambs. Using teasers doesn't appear to have a demonstrable difference to the success of joining ewe lambs. It's probably worth mentioning that ewe lambs generally have a higher proportion of ewes have that second short cycle. So generally a higher proportion than normal of ewe lambs have a second silent ovulation, which means that the bulk of their lambing will happen a bit later in the joining period. And I've had a couple of anecdotal reports from people suggesting that they have limited success with out of season breeding of ewe lambs. So November, December joining of ewe lambs, even when they've used teasers, has had limited success when compared to in-season breeding, that February, March period. So where's the value? Why would we bother using teasers? Well, simply, it's all about shortening the lambing period. So I guess the value sits with you if you see value in having a narrower age range of your lambs and your weaners. And just to illustrate that, if we're joining for 8 weeks and we're weaning it with the youngest at 10 weeks, at weaning we've got an 8-week difference in ages. So the youngest will be 10 weeks and the oldest will be 18. If we're joining for 5 weeks, the age range is going to be the youngest 10 weeks and the oldest is 5 weeks. I guess it's the difference that 3 weeks in age range has to your management and of the lambs and the weaners. Ultimately is where the value sits for whether you use teasers or not. So obviously with lambs, you've got a much tighter age range, so that would noticeably affect the way you sell lambs and how many you've got left at the end and the size of the tail. And similarly with weaner management going into summer, you'll have less smaller lambs going into summer, which we know has a significant effect on weaner survival. So just in summary, look, using teasers, it's really for out of season breeding of sheep, and it's really not going to be effective for breeds of sheep that are strongly seasonal, and they're typically your British breeds. First cross ewes of, say, a Board Leicester Merino, they do respond to the ram effect, but purebred Board Leicester ewes, for example, generally don't respond to the ram effect. What teasing does do, it concentrates lambing over a shorter period, and it allows, this is probably the important bit, it really allows out of season joining to be over 5 weeks rather than 7 or 8 weeks. It's important to remember that it doesn't necessarily increase the number of lambs born. So thank you. That I'll leave it there, and I'll be very, very pleased to take questions. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you for a very concise and clear presentation. So we're just going to give Ashley a rest there after that. And I'd like to reiterate that we have another webinar next week on Wednesday evening, and it's going to be focused on what cost-effective management options do we have to potentially increase the wool income from our prime lamb flocks. So we'll be looking at the obviously at the costs of doing so and the benefits, and see if there's anything that we can do to increase the overall profitability of the prime lamb operation through increasing wool revenue. At the end of tonight's webinar, there's going to be a survey pop up, so I appreciate that a fair few in the audience may want to duck off to bed as they have a big day of work ahead of them. You're more than welcome to leave the webinar now if you wish. Make sure you have a crack at that webinar survey when you tune out. We do take it seriously. We read all the feedback and respond to critical issues and take general feedback on board to help us shape the ongoing guise of the webinar series. So take a moment now to start jotting your questions into that questions box. Ashley's kindly offered to stay on as long as we need, so that we can, get some good questions answered. And it's not often we have people like Ashley close at hand to run those burning questions past. So Ashley, there's a few good questions coming through here. I might even take the liberty of asking the first one, if that's okay.
Fire away, thank you.
Yes. At the start, and I think it was reiterated there at some points, you made mention that the management practice of teasing was unlikely to be effective with the strongly seasonal breeds such as the Border Leicesters and Border Leicester derived composites. Now, that is a bit counterintuitive for me. I had expected that if an animal that was strongly seasonal, maybe the act of teasing would generate better results, especially in mind that a lot of the prime lamb operations do in general join and lamb earlier than the merino operations to try and get as many lambs finished within the growing period as they possibly can. So just thought you might want to comment on that.
It's because as I understand it, it's the day length response is so strong. That's what drives their reproductive behaviour. And I guess with merinos, for example, the day length effect is sort of moderately strong, so it's relatively easier to change that, I guess. Whereas and it was described to me, it's from the breeds of sheep that were further north, so in the north of England, those sort of sheep, that seasonal, that strongly seasonal reproductive behaviour is strongest, and it's just so strongly driven by day length. It's very difficult to break that. And I guess just merinos just don't have the same level of I suppose commitment to day length, and you see that through their natural cycling, that they a higher proportion are cycling all the time. It's just a much easier, I suppose. What it means is that day length doesn't have the same sort of strength of control over the breeding cycle. So with, say, the Border Leicesters, just because the day length is so strong, it's very difficult for anything else to I suppose to break that effect. Now, once you cross the Border Leicester with, say, a merino, that that effect sort of starts to break down quite quickly. So first cross border, which is why people with first cross merino border Leicester ewes can lamb when they do, can lamb typically in the can join in the November-December period successfully, because the ewes do respond to the presence of rams out of season.
Thank you. I've got a few other questions rolling in here, Ashley. So a question here from Eric. What effect, I think this was actually asked very early in the webinar, what effect does teasing merino use in January for February mating?
What effect does that have on the lamb drop? Well, once you get into the late part of January, a high proportion of ewes are cycling. So using teasers at that time is going to have a very small effect on the lambing pattern, I suppose, or the ovulation pattern of the ewes, just because the seasonal effect is kicking in naturally anyway. And we typically see joining from late January through February. That's reasonably common in Western Australia. 5 weeks works very, very well. You don't seem to get many more lambs if you join for 6 weeks over that period. It's just because their natural cycling is kicking into gear very, very quickly at that point.
Thank you. Eric's got another quick question here. Now, we may need to interpret this. Can I use the ram effect in place of teasers? I suppose Eric's referring to just putting the rams in earlier. Maybe. Hello, Ashley.
Yes.
Sorry, did you get that last question there?
No, I didn't hear it.
Sorry, Eric asked again, can I use the ram effect in place of teasers? Hello, Ashley.
Yes, sorry, I'm just thinking about that. It's one and the same thing. Are you there?
Yeah.
David, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Ashley. You may not be able to hear me that clearly.
Right, okay. No, I can hear you. Sorry, the question was, can I use the ram effect in place of teasers? Yes, I mean, they're one and the same thing. So the ram effect and teasers are working on the same principle. You're using the ram effect. Teasers are using the ram effect to induce ovulation in out of season ewes. So typically, well, I guess, look, typically with December joining, the first 2 weeks is the ram effect kicking in. So the reason there's not much going on in terms of conception in the first 2 weeks of a December joining is because it's the ram effect stimulating the ewes' reproductive system to kick into gear and start ovulating. That's why there's that lag for 2 weeks with, say, a November, December, early January joining. And that's the period that we try and say, well, okay, we're getting some lambs in that period, but the bulk of our lambs are coming after that. So we're using teasers to really cut out that 2 weeks where not much is happening from a lamb conception point of view, to give us a much tighter lamb drop.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. A question here from Ray. A question from Ryan. He asks of you, Ashley, can out of season breeding ewes, Border Leicester cross merinos, slip back into unestrus if rams are put in too early, or will they eventually get pregnant as the rams will be in for 8 to 10 weeks regardless?
Yeah, look, when they're out of season, regardless of whether rams are with them or not, eventually they will stop cycling. So it's something like 2 or 3 cycles, and then they start to stop cycling. So they slot into that anestrus period. Okay, so that's when they're out of season. So if you put the rams in for, say, 9 weeks, there is a period where they'll just stop cycling because they're out of season. They the rams are there, they're used to the rams being around, they're no longer having any stimulation on the ewes, and they've only got 2 or 3 cycles before they start to shut down again. This is out of season. Now, if they're in season, they'll keep cycling until either they conceive or the day length stimulates them to stop cycling. So irrespective of the presence of the ram. So in season, they'll keep cycling until they either conceive or the day length stimulates them to stop cycling. Out of season, irrespective of what's happening with, say, the presence of the rams, they will stop cycling at some point. So yes, so if you leave the rams in for a long time, they'll end up just not having any effect on the ewes whatsoever.
Rightio. Well, thank you, Ashley. There's a question here from Peter. It's a technical question. Now, Peter, he leads with a comment. There are 2 forms of testosterone, ethanoate and propionate. And Peter asks, what are you recommending? And also, Peter's comments that different vets have different instructions on dosing wethers. Some suggest 2 doses of testosterone 8 days apart, intramuscular, while others suggest subcutaneous. So a double-barrel question there, Ashley, but about the ethanoate, the propionate, and the correct dosing of wethers with testosterone.
Yes, look, the product, yes, that's really up to the vet. But look, the ones I'm aware of are Ropel, Banrot. They're the same products you use for pizzle rot control, and they're only available through vets. So, so the vet's best placed to tell you which product to use. Now, the only way to administer it that I'm aware of is a subcutaneous injection. I'm not aware of intramuscular. Now, the rate, yeah, look, that seems to vary from 5 mils as a single dose to 7 mils. And I don't know whether that's because of they're using different products or not. And then there's the other strategy of giving them something like 2 mils on day 0, 2 mils on day 7, 2 mils on day 14 when you join the teasers with the ewes. Now, I think that used to be the textbook sort of methodology, and then subsequent to that, the 5 mil single injection has been shown to be equally effective as the multiple dose. So I guess that's why certainly over in Western Australia, you just don't see people giving them multiple doses of testosterone. It's just 1 dose 7 days before you put them in with the ewes. It's just simpler and it's equally effective. But look, yes, no, you're quite right. In my research for this webinar, there's just a range of recommendations from a range of people. It's been quite interesting when you try and drill down as to what's actually recommended. It is. I can understand his frustration because I feel the same. But certainly from my perspective, we go with 5 mils 7 days before you put the teasers in with the ewes.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Ashley. Ashley,
now, if I can just, sorry, David, while I think of it, there was that question about leaving the rams in for longer. That just sort of touches on why I was saying it's important that when you put the teasers in, you put the rams in 14 days later, because if you leave the teasers in too long before putting the rams in, you run the risk of some of the ewes shutting down after a while, because they have their 2 or 3 cycles. So let's say you leave the teasers in for 3 or 4 weeks, and then you put the rams in, there'll be a proportion of ewes that go through their 2 or 3 cycles, don't conceive for whatever reason, and then they start to shut down. So there's that's why I think you'll find most vets you talk to are quite adamant that the rams have to go in sort of 14, 15 days after the teasers are introduced to the ewe flock. That's quite important.
Okay, no worries. Thank you very much, Ashley. A question here from Stacey. Now, Stacey asks, is there a difference when using virgin working rams with the teasing effect?
Short answer is no. No, because it's the pheromones that they release. So it's nothing to do with the physical sort of presence of the ram. It's about their pheromones. So it's the ewes are getting a sniff of the pheromones is what induces the ram effect. So the rams don't have to physically touch the ewes; they just have to be near them. And I think that's probably an important point, that it's not about how big the rams are and that sort of thing. It's about just how well the ewes can get a sniff of the pheromones that are floating around. So I guess that's sort of where the number of teasers is important. That if you've got a huge mob of ewes, several thousand, and it's conceivable that you'll find some ewes may not get close enough to the rams to get enough pheromone to induce the ram effect. But look, no, hogget age rams are equally effective as mature age rams.
Thank you.
As are testosterone treated hogget wethers.
A question here from Tony in Western Australia. He asked, would increasing the percentage of rams joined be a strategy, i.e. using 2.5%?
Yes, look, I think generally for commercial reasons, people operate at the low end of the ram number, I suppose. And there's good evidence to suggest that the more rams you use, up to something like 4%, you generally get more lambs. And that's particularly important when you're using teasers, because what you've done is you've induced the ewe flock to ovulate in a much shorter window. So there's a lot more ewes coming into season or on heat in a much shorter window, which would mean to give them the best chance of conceiving. If you have plenty of rams, that can only be a good thing. And I think you'll find there's quite a bit of research that sort of hints, that suggests quite strongly that more lambs are better. It's just that because more rams means you spend more money, people tend to operate at the low end of the recommended joining rates. But certainly, yeah, 2.5% is far better, particularly where you're using teasers, is far better than using sort of 1.5%. And that's particularly important, I guess, if we're using young rams.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Quick question here from Kirk. Kirk asks, is there any value of using teasers in dorpers?
Oh, that's a good question. I would suggest, given where they're from, I would suggest they're not strongly seasonal. I would suggest yes, but I couldn't tell you with any certainty. But just from knowing where they're from as a breed, I would have thought they'd behave very much like merino.
Fair enough. Maybe that's something for more investigation. But no, that's a good question. Now, a question here from Tom. Is there any benefit for using melatonin injections in ewes in and out of season joining?
Yes. Look, there was some work done by the Department of Ag here back in the 80s, where they did just that. They injected ewes with melatonin, and there was a positive interaction between the melatonin and teasers, in the sense that they got more lambs. So it increased. Yeah, there was a positive response to using melatonin and teasers to reproduction rate. So they used melatonin and teasers, and they got significantly more lambs born. So the short answer is yes.
Okay, perfect.
In fact, I've got that paper. I can, if he's keen, I can circulate that. If he lets you know, I'll be happy to give it to him.
Yeah, Tom, if you want to have a look at that paper, just leave us a message here, and I'll make sure that we get that to you. A question here from Neil. Neil asks, is one dose of testosterone enough, or is 2 doses better, about a week apart? No,
look, I think that work's been done quite quite extensively. One 5 ml dose is equally effective as the multiple dose strategy, which is why people generally only do the 1 ml. It's just easier and equally effective. So there isn't any advantage in the multiple dose.
Thank you. Question here. How far away does the ram flock need to be from the ewes to get an effect? Maybe
yes, thank you for that question.
Yep.
I understand the question. Yeah, look, thank you for that. That's an important omission on my part. Look, for the ram effect to work, the ewes have to be, I think the distance is something like 1 kilometre, at least 1 kilometre away for around 4 weeks at least. So they need to be physically separated by at least 1 kilometre for at least 4 weeks before introducing teasers or rams to get the ram effect happening. Now, what happens if that doesn't occur is that you'll have a higher number of ewes naturally cycling because they've had contact with the rams. And then what happens is when you put your rams in, as I was saying earlier, in an out of season breeding time, sorry, let me start again. When you're joining rams to ewes out of season, the ewes will only have 2 or 3 cycles before they start to shut off. So if they've been exposed to rams earlier and they're already cycling to some degree, by the time you put your working rams in, you might find that significant numbers of them start to shut down before the working rams have been able to sort of cover them all. Now, I think the kilometre is just the number they pull out, but the ultimate objective is that the ewes can't get a sniff of the rams. I guess that's the ultimate. So I guess if your rams are downwind all the time, I suspect that's going to solve the problem. But obviously you can't engineer that. But it's not the distance per se. It's just the ewes are sufficiently separated that they don't get any hint of the rams being near them. And that's really only a problem for out of season joining.
Thanks, Ashley. So I suppose my comment on that, Ashley, is that the inverse of that scenario is that does that mean that if the rams are, within that threshold distance of the ewes within the 4 weeks on the lead up to joining, and that they should be sufficiently teased anyway, i.e. they won't actually need teasing?
Well, it depends how long they were in contact with the rams. If they've been if they've had that sort of contact for a long time, you'll find that significant proportion of the ewes, this is in the out of season period, the ewes would have done their 2 or 3 cycles and they would have gone back into an anestrus sort of phase. So they're not cycling anymore. So it would be almost doing the opposite to what you want them to do. So it stimulated them, but because they don't have working rams with them, they're not getting joined or they're not conceiving, and then so they shut down, so they stop ovulating. So then you put your rams in, and you've still got significant numbers of ewes that are not cycling, and it'll still take them a couple of weeks for their reproductive system to kick back in again. So
well, that begs the question.
Yes.
If they've been teased and then they fall anestrus, unless the teasing effect pulls them again back out of anestrus, and then having that sort of raises a bigger issue, doesn't it? If you're have an out of season joining and you do have your ram paddock next to your ewes or a mob of ewes, then it could be quite deleterious to your conception rates, couldn't it?
Oh, that's right. Yep. There is a refinement on that. If they're familiar with the rams, let's say, for example, you've got a mob of rams next to a mob of ewes in separate paddocks, and this is what we're talking about. But if if you bring in some different RAMs that the ewes aren't familiar with, because they're different, that will trigger the RAM effect in those ewes. But if you join the ewes, if you join the RAMs that are have been side by side with the ewes, they're familiar to the ewes, and you don't get the same effect. Now, I must admit, I've not seen that or had any experience with that personally. That's what I've sort of been told by a reproduction physiologist out of UWA, but that's something that I've not had any personal experience with. But look, at the end of the day, people use teasers quite widely, and it generally works quite reliably. So what I would say is that the proximity of the RAMs, it's important, but from just what people do sort of routinely commercially, it seems to work. It doesn't appear to be a major problem from what people normally do with their RAMs and their ewes. It doesn't seem to be a major problem to getting the teasing thing to work. So while technically it's a real issue, in practice, I guess I don't see that being a major problem just based on people do with their ewes and their RAMs. They generally have sufficient distance between them normally for teasers to work reliably. That's certainly been my experience, that using teasers is reliable, which means it does do what it's supposed to do most of the time. Yeah. So technically the RAM and ewe separation's an issue, but in practice I don't think it really is, because I just see most people have success with teasing.
Okay, right. Well, thank you. A question here from Eric again. Eric asks, could you potentially change day length by locking ewes into the dark to shorten the estrus?
Yes, I think they've done that in various trials. They've had them in sheds and they've manipulated the lighting to simulate day length, and they have been able to change the reproductive behaviour. Yes, so the short answer to that's yes. And the other one is using those melatonin injections. That's effectively it's a melatonin response the ewes have rather than day length.
Yeah. Okay. So it's achieving the same outcome.
Now, the only thing with teasers I'm not sure about is if someone's joining in February, March, and they want to go to a 3-week joining, where the teasers might help get a few more ewes joined in that 3-week period. So if someone's looking to really contract their lambing window to say 3 weeks, I wonder whether teasers might increase the success of a high proportion of ewes conceiving in that first cycle. But that would I haven't seen any research on that at all. But that's sort of one thing I would think about for teasing in that sort of February period. But that's just pure. That's just the thought I've had.
No worries. Well, thank you. Question. Eric's got another question here. He's a big contributor to the question time tonight. How long do the ewes have to smell the rams in order for the teasing effect or the ram effect to work?
Oh, it's very short. Like it's just a sniff, I gather, is all it needs. It doesn't need much at all. Like it's very little. So it's not days or it's not hours. It's just a bit.
Okay, no, fair enough. Thank you.
So I think even rams going up the laneway past a mob of ewes, that's enough.
I think we've dealt with this question here already. Tom asks, but just in case you see anything within Tom's question that we may not have dealt with specifically, is there any advantage in isolating ewes a distance away from the rams or teasers prior to the process of teasing?
Yes, 100%. Yes, you'll get a much greater effect the further the ewes and the rams are away, and the longer they're separated. Definitely. Yeah.
Perfect.
You get a much greater response to the ram effect if the ewes haven't had any contact with rams for a long time.
The question here from Martin and Sophia. Now, they're a great couple up towards Corindi, and they're a big supporter of the webinar series. They've just asked a quick question here. They've been thinking about the use of teasers for crossbred ewes. Their specific question is, what do you recommend to them as the best option as far as what type of teaser? Should they use potty wethers with testosterone, or should they actually go out and invest in a vasectomized ram or rams for their flock?
Well, my view of the research is that it doesn't make any difference. But funny enough, having spoken to a vet this afternoon, he's seen a swing back to people using vasectomized rams. I can't think of a reason why that would be. Certainly my experience and my reading of the literature, the wethers are equally effective. You could probably get away with a lower proportion of rams than you do with, say, wethers. The advantage of wethers is that you don't have to take them out when you put the rams in, whereas when you use vasectomized rams, you really have to take them out, because they will fight or compete with the working rams, because they're probably a similar size. Whereas a wether doesn't. Well, physically, a wether can't compete with a ram. The rams are just too big. So that's the only reason you would have to take wethers out. That if the wethers were interfering with the working rams because they were bigger, which is hard to believe, that's why you take them out. So with vasectomized rams, you really have to take them out, which is another job. You've got to bring them in, draft them off, all sort of business. So, but in terms of effectiveness of the ram effect, testosterone treated wethers are equally effective as vasectomized rams. Yeah. I suppose probably the difference is that once you vasectomize a ram, you've got them for the rest of their life. You don't have to do it again, whereas you have to inject the wethers every year to get the same effect. So, yeah, so I guess I wouldn't see any difference between the two, other than those management practices in terms of the differences between the two.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you. Now, a question here from Neil. What's the optimum size, mob size for the ewes, i.e. can the mobs get too big?
I think in bigger mobs with, say, teasers, I think you generally, when you've got big mobs, you generally go with the higher rate of teasers, just because it's important for the ewes to get sufficient sort of chance to sort of get the pheromones. But certainly commercially, in our experience, we really haven't seen any effect of big mobs. And I've got clients that join ewes in 2,000 and 3,000 head mobs. I don't see any indication that that's having an effect. The difference would be at lambing time. We do know there is a significant effect of mob size at lambing, particularly with multiple lambs, which I'm sure most of you, most of the people on the webinar would be aware of. But at joining time, I haven't seen any evidence in my experience that suggests that, provided the ram number is right, there really hasn't been any indication to me that mob size is an issue with joining.
Perfect, thank you. So there's a few more questions here to come, just to provide you with some context around, the questions submitted by everyone here tonight. Ashley, probably another half a dozen or so to go. Now,
no worries.
A question here from, a quick comment from Sandra. Yes, Sandra, no worries. And Tom, both of them requested that article that you mentioned about the use of melatonin injections. So if Ashley will send that to me, and I'll make sure
I'll pass that on.
Yeah, you guys get them. Now, a question, a curly one from Peter. Peter's out near Hay in the sort of pastoral riverina. He asks, can billy goats influence the ram effect, i.e. overcome the exclusion for rams prior to teasing or joining?
Now, goats have goats are seasonal breeders as well, and I think they also respond to the ram effect from memory. But I don't know for certain, but I suspect being a different sort of species that the male goat wouldn't have any effect on the ewe. That would be my thought. But I'd have to ask my friend at the university as to how that might work. So look, I'll just take that question, David, and I'll research that further for you if you like.
Yeah, no worries. We'll take that on notice. Thanks for a good question there, Peter. Quick question here from Ryan. Border Leicester Merino ewes being serviced in early December, out of season or not? I apologise, I'm stumbling here. So are Border Leicester Merino Cross ewes being serviced in early December, out of season or not? Then if day length effect starts late December. So pretty much a question around whether early December is out of season.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Look, for February, March, April's the peak natural breeding season for all sheep. And you'd find the Border Leicester Merino crosses behave more like Merinos, so they're not nearly as strong seasonally wise as, say, a purebred Border Leicester. So using teasers for joining in November, December would have the same effect as they would do for Merino. So yeah, look, so if you're joining in November, December, and you want to shorten up the lamb drop in terms of time, teasers, you'd use teasers for Merino ewes, for Merino Border Leicester cross ewes. So I think the short answer to that one's yes. Yeah. So the defined breeding season for sheep is clearly February, March, April. That's the peak of it. And it does start to increase a little bit through December, but it really kicks into it in late January.
Yeah. Rightio. Question here from James. James asked, costs. Do you have any idea about the cost of hormone-treated wethers versus vasectomized rams? And that would be also relevant for Sophia and Martin Costa.
Sure. I guess you don't have to, like, just for example, the rams. You can have your own entire rams. If they don't have to be anything special, they just have to be entire males. That's all they have to be. Now, I had a chat to a vet this afternoon, and he quoted me what he charges is $80 per ram for the procedure, but you only do it once in the ram's life, of course. So I guess it's not a recurring procedure. And I think I saw somewhere that now, at the risk of being wrong, I think I saw somewhere that the testosterone is something like $15 a dose, something like that. But please don't quote me. But I'm pretty sure it's in that order. It's something like that. So vasectomized rams, I'm sure it varied from vet to vet, but the chap I was quoted this afternoon was $80. And the only thing I'd say is the testosterone, I think it's around that $15, $12, $15, something like that.
No worries. Well, thank you. So this might be one of our last questions here from Paul. Paul is up at Armidale, and Paul, you might be interested in that. I'm hosting this webinar from Armidale tonight, so we're not far apart. Paul asks, if my rams have been running next to well-grown Hogget Border Leicester Merino ewes for the last 2 weeks, should I join them in December? What's the chance of a good result?
It's probably more an issue as to their live weight. So if they can tick all the boxes on live weight, so that's be in the mid-40s at least. Then the next question is, whether you want to join them in December, whether that fits in with your the rest of your sheep. Because I think ewe lambs, anecdotally, when you're joining sort of ewe hoggets, I'm talking about 7 to 9 month-year-old ewe lambs. I'm presuming Paul is as well.
No, I think
anecdotally.
Paul will be talking about the hoggets, so I suspect that'd be. I suspect.
Oh, these are maiden ewes.
Yeah.
These are 1.5-year-olds.
Yeah.
Okay.
Unless Paul qualifies differently.
Yep. Okay. No worries. Well, look, unless he joins normally in December, I would stick to his normal lambing time. I'm guessing he lambs in February, March, and I don't see any reason why you would change that based on the fact that because when the season comes around, they will just naturally start cycling, irrespective of what's happened to them back in December, being in contact with rams. So I guess probably the point is that once the season changes and they move into the breeding season, the ram effect drops away as an issue. Like whether they've been with rams or not is eclipsed by the seasonality of their breeding, of their reproductive system. So if Paul's worried about the rams interfering with the likely result if he's joining in February, March, then I'd say he's got nothing to worry about. I'd stick to his February, March joining if that's what he does normally.
Fair enough, thank you. Look, a final question here from Eric. Eric just flicks through one. Is there any info on what is a comfortable number of ewes a ram can serve per day? Now, I'm not sure whether Eric's referring specifically to teasers or actual rams doing the job.
I didn't hear the question. Did you read it out?
Sorry, yes. Is there any information on what is a comfortable number of ewes a ram can serve per day?
Oh, yeah. Look, when we per day, oh, Struth. He's testing me now. Oh, no, look, I'll be guessing. I often can't remember what that is.
No, that's fair enough. That's no worries at all.
No, sorry.
Okay, that's no worries. We'll take that one on notice, Eric. A bit of positive feedback here from Lindsay. A very interesting, well-presented webinar. Thank you. So it's often a thankless task presenting webinars, Ashley, because you don't get that feedback as you may have experienced tonight. But every now and then someone sends through a positive comment, and yeah, it's indicative of a good webinar. So well done. And that actually wraps up the questions for this evening. And thank you very much for the audience at providing some good inquiring questions, reflective of an educated and critically thinking audience for our presenter, Ashley Herbert, tonight. Ashley, I suppose on behalf of the audience and MLA, thank you very much for taking up, making yourself available to present tonight's webinar.
My pleasure. I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much, and thank you all for listening in. I have enjoyed it, so thank you.
Yeah, awesome. A few other positive comments coming through there too, Ashley, from Eric. He's thanking you for answering all these questions, and Neil, he also says well done. So very, very positive, and thank you for everyone for supporting the MLA Sheep Productivity and Profitability webinar series. Don't forget that we have a webinar next week, going to be focused on the cost-effective management tactics we have to increase wool revenue from prime lamb flocks. It's going to be presented by Mr. Andrew Woods of Independent Commodity Services and myself. Don't forget to have a crack at the post-webinar survey. We do take notice of that, and we'll be able to provide that feedback to tonight's presenter, Ashley, and to MLAs to help them improve future MLA activities. And well, that's pretty much it from me, and we'll follow up on those few items that we talked to there. We'll be able to get you the paper that Ashley mentioned, and we'll also provide tonight's notes to the audience. So thank you very much, and we will be hearing from everyone this time next week. Have a good evening.